Dr. Joanne Fletcher, in her book The Search for Nefertiti, wrote, ever since the monarchy had started to strongly support the sun god back in the reign of Amenhotep II in the 1420s BC, the priests of Amun had seen their power slowly eroded by successive kings, and this must have been the final straw. The highly conservative priests had been forced to stand by as their sacred precincts were hacked about and redesigned, and whereas previous monarchs had swelled Amun's coffers with tribute, this king and queen were demanding that the flow be reversed. As the images and inscriptions were defaced, cult statues melted down, and their treasuries ransacked, the incalculable wealth of centuries was now laid at the feet of the new gods, the Aten, Akhenaten, and Nefertiti. And at this point, we pause one more time to emphasize how important this statement is, because what we're actually reading here is a prelude to a future genocide. What we are actually hearing here with Dr. Joanne Fletcher's remarks about the wanton destruction, we're going to see again in history. My work is to show you that the origins of the destruction of the Druids in the far western hemisphere is part 2 of the destruction of the Atenists. Perhaps this time Akhenaten, by that time Akhenaten had died and he wasn't at the helm. But in my thesis, this is only part 1 of a campaign of destruction. So that when we see the isolated, apparently isolated story of Ireland, which has always been treated as a very isolated thing, when we often hear about the destruction of the Druids, the question of Egypt never enters our mind. We think of Romans, you see, we think of the coming of Christianity perhaps, we think of Norman invasions, and we think of internecine fightings amongst the Britons, and the question of Egypt never arises. So my work delves into this area, controversial area, that links the destruction. And we can see that Egypt was ransacked, Egypt was destroyed, Egypt was eviscerated in exactly the same way that we find a little bit later in history. Is there a connection? I think there most definitely is a connection. Now from the Stele of Cairo, we read that from Abu, that's Elephantine, to the swamps of the Delta, the properties of the temples of the gods and goddesses had been destroyed. Their shrines were in a state of ruin, and their estates had become a desert. Weeds grew in the courts of the temples. The sanctuaries were overthrown, and the sacred sites had become thoroughfares for the people. The land had perished. The gods were sick unto death, and the country was set behind their backs. Let us remember that this particular passage comes from the Egyptians themselves. This is not some later writer. This is from an old stele from Egypt, a record of the kind of aftermath, the destruction and the aftermath of this demagogue. The temple walls were mutilated by the Atenites. The priesthoods were driven out, and all temple properties were confiscated and applied to the propagation of the cult of Aten. The figures of the great gods that were made of gold and other precious metals in the shrines were melted down, and thus the people could not consult their gods in their need, for the gods had no figures wherein to dwell, even if they wished to come upon the earth. There were no priests left in the land, no gods to entreat, no funeral ceremonies could be performed, and the dead had to be laid in their tombs without the blessing of the priests. And Mesod and Roger Saba, in their book Secret of the Exodus, they say that Akhenaten had already levied a sacred tax on the country and had set up numerous forced labor projects for the construction of the Theban temples as well as other temples to Aten in the rest of the country. Then he decided that a large part of the revenues of the old capital Thebes should be directed to Akhenaten. He doubtless did the same thing to the other cities of Egypt, strangling bit by bit the whole country to the profit of the city of light. All Egypt worked for the grandeur of its god king Akhenaten. So the Atenists were not just ideologically opposed to the Amonists, they were at physical war with them. They didn't want a trace of their rivals to exist. And this didn't matter if the whole country was to suffer. These so-called monotheists didn't mind if their wanton destruction completely unnerved and unseated the populace of Egypt. Ahmed Osman, in his book Christianity and Egyptian Religion, says this is the first time in Egyptian history that we find the king's cabinet composed almost totally of army generals who could have gained their positions of power and later on the throne only as the result of a military coup. So it's the first time in Egyptian history that the king is surrounded by military. Lorraine Evans says that if we take the reliefs at face value, then it could be argued that the city of Akhenaten was virtually an armed camp. Large platoons march at double speed or stand at ease, and it is noticeable that these forces are never very far away from the figure of Akhenaten. There are soldiers under arms standing in front of the palaces and the temples and the watchtowers which border the city. Nicholas Reeve says, Akhenaten was clearly not a man open to reasoned argument. He demanded from his subjects complete and utter subservience. The tomb and temple reliefs show him and his family adored by groveling populace, but the adoration is far from spontaneous. Closer inspection reveals that the people are kept in check by large numbers of troops with batons. Now, reading this, it's hard to believe, you see, that 9 times out of 10, the historians of the world, the Egyptologists, lionize Akhenaten. Look at Akhenaten's image in the media. Go to the academic works, and you'll find that almost every Egyptologist, every archaeologist, even though they may say a few sentences that show that maybe he wasn't completely normal, basically lionize the man as the Christ before the Christ, the great enlightener, the first monotheist. I've listed in Book 2 some of the comments of these academics after they first discovered that there was such a man. And it was remarkable that these individuals would do this. And that alone raises certain questions. Who are these Egyptologists? Why do they think that this Atenus tyrant, this demagogue, this ransacker and looter and pillager and desecrator was so wonderful? Where does the dementia end in all of this? Ahmed Osman, in his book Moses and Akhenaten, writes, the persecution of first Amun and then the other gods, which must have been exceedingly hateful to the majority of the Egyptians, would certainly also be hateful to the individual members of the army. This persecution, which entailed the closing of temples, the dispatch of artisans who entered everywhere to hack out his name from inscriptions, the presumed banishment, the excommunication of his very name, could not have been carried out without the army's active support. Each time a squad of workmen entered a temple to destroy the name of Amun, it must have been supported by a squad of soldiers who came to see that the royal decree was carried out without opposition. And now we come to a very, very important passage. It's Graham Phillips' Act of God. And he writes, there are almost no soldiers in native Egyptian dress depicted anywhere near Akhenaten. Among foreigners, quite obviously of African origin, are a large number of figures who appear to be officers in Asiatic dress, identical to that worn by the Hyksos in scenes discovered at Avaris. Avaris is the capital of the Hyksos. Who the Hyksos are, we will deal with in a moment. But first, what is Philip saying here? That Akhenaten was so loathed. Akhenaten, as we read earlier, was basically so foreign to Egypt, so out of touch, that he decided that the god Aton, who was a minor god, would suddenly become the supreme god, so out of touch with his people that their cares and their needs, he could heed not. We find that then when his despotism began, he had to have mercenaries. He had to hire foreign soldiers. I mean, this sounds familiar, does it not? That he had to bring in oppressors from outside, mercenaries who would serve him to oppress his own people. if indeed we're to believe that the Egyptians were his own people. But more to the point, the term has now been introduced in this particular slide, the Hyksos. And from now on we get into some very, very controversial but fascinating areas. The Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. In the past, I wrote, the historians Manetho, Josephus, and Strabo proclaimed the wandering Israelite tribes to be intimately connected with the pharaonic dynasties of Egypt. Nowadays, a few researchers carry on the revisionist work of Karl Abrahams, Sigmund Freud, Immanuel Velikovsky, and Commons Beaumont, and they help us to understand where the mysterious people of the Bible came from. Most importantly, we discover that the Israelites, so-called, were certainly not impoverished, oppressed slaves, as most of the world has been expertly conditioned to believe. The chiefs of the so-called Israelites had been pharaohs themselves and were related to and descended from the Hyksos pharaohs of the 13th dynasty. Their great capitals were Memphis and Avaris. Avaris was later renamed Pi-Ramesses, but had been known as Zaru or Zion. It was situated in the Goshen area of the Bible, that is, in the eastern zone of the Nile Delta. Suggestively, it was the city where Akhenaten had grown up and been educated. The Atnas coterie, who were expelled along with Akhenaten, were, like the pharaoh himself, members of this Hyksos dynasty of wealthy and powerful kings and priests. So the Hyksos dynasty, who appear in Egypt about the 13th dynasty, we've been talking about Akhenaten in the 18th dynasty, but the Hyksos kings, the Hyksos pharaohs, were a despotic, unloved, and possibly foreign invading group. And these Atanists may, in fact, according to the evidence, be descended from this Hyksos strain of pharaohs and from their dynasty. Certainly, we find out that Akhenaten grew up in the Delta area, in the area that was controlled by the Hyksos. Specifically of importance is the city of Avaris. This is where we get the term avarice, meaning greed, from the ancient city of Avaris, which was the capital of these so-called Hyksos kings. Ralph Ellis takes on the job and demolishes a great lie. In his book, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, he says, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were not a family of poor, captive, downtrodden shepherds at all. They were nothing less than the Hyksos, the shepherd king pharaohs of Egypt. He goes on to say, Akhenaten, according to both the revised biblical history and the king lists of Egypt, was a direct descendant of the Hyksos pharaohs, who were so strongly influenced by the priests of Heliopolis. And these, of course, are the priests of the sun cult that he's talking about. This deity has to be a direct result of their influence. It is simply the Hyksos belief system under another name. Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, must have had many sympathies with this belief in the Aton as well, but he never dared openly to promote this new cult. So Ralph Ellis helps us to see the connection between the Hyksos and the Atanists. That previous pharaohs, like the father of Akhenaten, certainly would have worshipped Aten, but they may have done it privately. The pharaohs had private gods, and they then had the public worship, the worship that was accepted, that was traditional, that was standardized, and it was expected of the pharaoh. But these are just royal duties. Behind closed doors, in their own private temples, they were worshippers of the sun god Aton, and it's only during the time of Akhenaten that the Atanists emerge, and by that time they're very powerful. So contrary to belief of most historians, maybe this Atanism didn't just arise with Akhenaten. Maybe the priests of Heliopolis, of the great sun cult. These are people who put the pharaoh in power. They're the ones who decide which of the princes will become the pharaoh. You couldn't become pharaoh without the priest's authentication and authorization. So perhaps, as some scholars have worked out, some scholars believe that this powerful sun cult that was against the Amonists, they were behind the young, frenetic, and possibly demented Akhenaten. Now, regarding the Hyksos connection, The author Ralph Ellis has established that the syllable hic, H-Y-K, has two meanings that might easily be confused. And we saw this element of confusion earlier on in the presentation when we analyzed the word Hebrew and saw that it could have derived from apiru, meaning wanderer, vagabond, migrant, or it could have arisen from the Ibaru, which meant astrologer, wise one, adept, and so forth. Well, here we have the same issue with this syllable hic. The term can mean either captive or king, depending upon whether the Y is pronounced like an I, as in Nick, or as a Y, as in Mike. Ergo, historians can easily misidentify the Hyksos people. And boy, oh boy, is that an understatement. Anyone who's up on these subjects, anybody who's done their homework, knows that that is exactly the case, that the Hyksos people have been a bone of contention for generations. Every scholar has a different idea of who they were, where they came from. One could do a whole presentation on just the Hyksos alone. And the main controversy is, of course, where did they come from? Were they native to Egypt, or did they invade from the outside? This is primarily the great bone of contention. But the great Commons Beaumont was miles ahead of everybody, and years before he wrote of the connection between the Israelites and the Hyksos. He already had it in the bag. He wrote, "These alleged Israelites, who had bred and multiplied to such an amazing number as to constitute a threat to the Egyptians, can only be explained as the descendants of the original Hyksos who had stayed behind 327 years previously." Sigmund Freud discusses the whole question of Moses and his connection to the Israelites. He says, "Tradition maintains that Moses was a Levite. This seems a transparent distortion of the actual state of affairs. The Levites were Moses' people. In later times we find Egyptian names only among the Levites." So there we go. Sigmund Freud already doubted the official story and started to speculate, started to muse deeply on the fact that, wait a minute, were these Israelites probably connected to the royalty of Egypt? Just like Beaumont is saying, yes, they were. Just like in more recent times, Ralph Ellis has again picked up the trail to say, well, wait a minute, these Israelites, these Judites, these Levites, there's nothing ragged. There's nothing sodden and foreign about these people. They didn't enter into Egypt in the way that the Old Testament tells us, and the way that most Jews and Christians are familiar with the journeys of Abraham and the incarceration of Joseph, the man in the coat of many colors who suddenly from baker or some menial job suddenly becomes the court astrologer to the Pharaoh of Egypt. One minute he's in jail and the next minute he's the richest man in Egypt. Or the stories of Jacob and all of this stuff that we've grown up learning about. The speculation is that that's the cover story. That these individuals knew Egypt. They were elites within Egypt. What does that do to official history? Sigmund Freud goes on to say, "Among the greatest riddles of Jewish prehistoric times is that concerning the antecedents of the Levites. They are said to have been derived from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Levi. But no tradition has ever ventured to pronounce on where that tribe originally dwelt, or what portion of the conquered country of Canaan had been allotted to it. They occupied the most important priestly positions, but yet they were distinguished from the priests. A Levite is not necessarily a priest. It is not the name of a caste." Douglas Reed, in his suppressed book, The Controversy of Zion, writes, "The little tribe from the south, Judah, became identified with the landless tribe, that of the Levites. These hereditary priests, who claimed that their office had been bestowed on them by Jehovah on Mount Sinai, were the true fathers of Judaism. They wandered amongst the tribes, preaching that the war was one of the war of all, and Jehovah's war. Their aim was power, and they strove for a theocracy, a state in which God is the sovereign and religion the law." So God is the sovereign and religion the law. So the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. They date from a very early period, about the 12th or 13th dynasty. And when it comes to talking about prototypes and antitypes and archetypes of later biblical characters, we find some of them amongst the Hyksos princes and kings. For instance, Amen-Emhet, the first of the 12th dynasty, is believed by a few Egyptologists to be Abraham of the Old Testament. Then we have Amen-Emhet, the third, who is believed to have been Joseph, that wealthy Hebrew dream analyst with the coat of many colors. Now, Akhenaten's concern was not, as has been insinuated by academic sycophants, to spiritualize the country. In effect, it was to de-spiritualize it. His demented concern was to have the God of his Levitical family to be everyone's God. Few in Egypt shared his sentiments or thought this was a good idea. He had support only from other members of his family, from henchmen and court guards, from foreign parts hired to protect him, and from certain Hyksos sun priests at Heliopolis, Avaris, and Memphis. And as we said, these priests of the Delta's solar cult appear to have had a hand in electing the pompous king to his elevated but much misused office. Certainly, as the old historians have written, it was at the city of Heliopolis that Moses received his education, or shall we say, his indoctrination. Lawrence Gardner writes in his Genesis of the Grail Kings, "It is generally reckoned that the Hyksos pharaoh, Apepi II, was the last hereditary dragon king in Egypt, but it would appear that the heritage was perpetuated through the female line into the new dynasties." So the Hyksos may not have been banished or completely expurged from Egypt in the early part of the 18th dynasty. The Atenists may have been connected to them in some way. This is what a lot of scholars are starting now to understand. And that, of course, the Dragon King, the Dragon Court, that William Bramley, the author, has referred to as the Brotherhood of the Snake. And of course we've seen the headdresses, the coronets of the pharaohs, and the symbol for the serpent, and the symbol of the dragon. But let us not ever doubt for a moment that there are many reasons why a symbol will be used. So if we were to see the symbol of the serpent on ancient monuments like we do in Ireland, or in ancient scripts and chronicles, if we see the symbol in the dragon dances of China, for instance, or if we again see it on flags and ancient coins and heraldry, or in ancient temples, and if we see it as we do used by the Egyptians, there could be many reasons. It doesn't mean that the symbol is negative or evil in itself. In fact, in my work on astrotheology, I've shown that the original usage of the serpent was because it represented something astrological. The symbol of the serpent, as used by elites and royals, as used on the caduceus of Hermes, for instance, was really a symbol relating to the constellation of Draco, which was a universal symbol for royalty and for nobility. And in fact, the symbol of the serpent, when studied correctly, is one of the links that proves that there was a connection between the Eastern and Western hemispheres, because this symbol was universal. And when it comes to the symbol of the serpent itself, or the dragon, we find that still being used today, and we find it alarmingly on the symbols of royalty of many royal houses of Europe and Britain. Often it's hybridized with a kind of lion figure. These are kind of two Atenist symbols, because of course what we're dealing with here is composite symbols, just in the same way that a word is made up of many syllables. These ancients used to know how to blend certain symbols together. Of course, we know that the lion was sacred to Aton and sacred to Akhenaten. Lions have been found at the great city of Amarna and also at Akhetaten, the city of Akhenaten. We know that the serpent would have been still beloved of Akhenaten. He wouldn't entirely have expurged that symbol because, of course, it was the universal symbol for royalty in Egypt. And since he was the pharaoh, wearing that symbol would have meant his status. So when we look at these logos and we look at this heraldry, we're seeing a composite images of serpent merged with the lion. Here we see the symbol of the rampant dragon, the winged serpent, on the columns outside the city of London. This is the guardian dragon that guards the way to the corporate precinct within London. London is situated, the city of London, and as we said earlier, it's a sun temple area. London was Ludunum, the city of Lu, the city of the sun. So isn't it interesting that the city of London is positioned on an ancient Irish site dedicated to the Lords of the Sun? And isn't it interesting that the corporate area known as the city is guarded by twin dragons, guardian dragons? Here we find it on the standard of the Prince of Wales, 4 dragons with a crown in the center. And interestingly, as we'll see later, at his coronation, Charles sat upon a throne bearing a red dragon emblem. Well, of course, he's the Prince of Wales, and the symbol of Wales, the symbol of the Cymry, has always been the red dragon. Does this again point to Egypt? His mother, the Queen of England, spoke these words over him: "This dragon gives you your power, your throne, and your authority." So here we have it. It's just a little bit more than the divine right of kings. She's not saying to her son that you're given the right to rule by the people. She's not saying that I give you the right to rule. She's not saying God bestows your right to be the Prince of Wales. She's saying this dragon, this red dragon. Now most people will think, oh, that just means Wales. But does it? Is metaphor being used here? Is symbolic terms being used here? Well, we've been talking about the Hyksos. Now it's important to look more deeply at their beliefs and what kind of god they worshipped. Well, the major god worshipped by the early Hyksos kings was known as Set, S-E-T. He's also known as Seth, Sut, or Sutek. Set had many symbols attached to him. He was symbolized by the giraffe and by the red desert. In fact, his color was red, and one of his symbols was the red cross. In the myth of Set and Horus, this mirrors the conflict between the Atenists and the Ammonists. Satam means hated. And look where we find that symbol of the red cross, not only on the bishops and the popes, but on many flags. In fact, the red cross is to be found as the very symbol, the very flag of England, known as St. George's Cross. We find it on the flag of Northern Ireland. We find it on the charities like the Red Cross. Now in Egyptian, a title for Set was the Juji, pronounced something like Juji. This is the probable origin of the name adopted by so many British kings, Georgie or George. The name refers directly to the god Set. One of the most powerful Masonic societies is known as the Order of St. Michael and St. George. And both St. Michael and St. George we see in depictions of these saints and knights the symbol of the Red Cross, and we also see the symbol of the dragon. Now the pharaonic crown of Lower Egypt, the area dominated by the Hyksos, was known as Deshret, or Red Crown. Ergo, it is not St. George who is the patron saint of England, but Set of the Hyksos. Hargrave Jennings, in his book The Masculine Cross and Ancient Sex Worship, published in 1874, wrote, "The rabbis say that when Aaron was made high priest, he was marked in the forehead by Moses with the figure X, or with a cross." We see the red cross in Christian artwork, and we see, as these pictures show, that the Pope wears the symbol of the red cross, and the prelates and bishops also. Turning to Masonry and its connection with Egypt and its connection with the Serpent Lodge or the Dragon Court, author J.S.M. Ward, in his masterpiece on Freemasonry, discussed high-degree rituals and symbols. His description of the 25th degree, entitled Knight of the Brazen Serpent, reveals that the lodge is referred to by Masons as the Court of Sinai. So Freemasonry is very connected with these ancient Judaic people that we're now exposing as really the Hyksos dynasties, the Dragon Court. Masonry is directly connected to these times and to these cults and sects and castes. In his book Freemasonry and the Ancient Gods, Churchward writes, "The most powerful Grand Master represents Moses. The wardens, who are called ministers, represent Aaron and Joshua. The orator is called Pontiff. The secretary is called the Grand Graver. And the candidate is known as a traveler. The jewel is a serpent entwined around a tau cross, standing on a triangle, worn suspended from a red ribbon." So, from the Masonic books themselves, from J.S.M. Ward and from Churchward, we learn that in Masonic ritual there's the use of the old Egyptian serpent, there's the use of the symbol of the crown, there's the use of the symbol of the tau cross and the red ribbon. But we don't have to take any writer's word for it. We can trust to our own eyes by a study of the Masonic, Freemasonic and Templar symbolism. Here on the flag of France, the state of Lorraine, which is a Freemasonic bastion. The Dukes of Lorraine were always the elites of Templarism and Masonry. On the right, a symbol which has been used by the Templars and also by the Scottish Rite Freemasons of America. We see the whole story, the crown and the cross. We see the cross is red. We see the background has the rays of the sun, sacred to Atonists. We see the black Malta cross, and we see the twin swords representing again the idea of conflict and rivalry, a primal rivalry. And it's picked up in corporate logos such as the Alfa Romeo symbol, which not only incorporates the red cross but also the serpent, the dragon. We see it here on the Knights Templar emblems, a symbol of the red cross. And many have pointed out that this Templar type Malta cross, despite its color, is really a cryptic symbol of the Great Pyramid of Egypt, seen from above. But on the right, you can draw your attention to the most important symbol of the Knights Templar, which is two riders on a single mount. The horse is pointed towards the west. The two shields is a cryptic symbol for the double cross, but again, the cross is colored red. And the fact that there's two of them, we will address a little bit later when we deal with the Scythians. Here is Godefroy de Bouillon, the Grand Master of Templarism, wearing the large red cross. Here we find it on the most prestigious Order of the Garter. And also make a note there. It'll be important in a later section of this presentation. Around the shield on the left is a blue belt. Well, that belt is actually known as a garter. Hence the Order of the Garter, of which the Queen of England is the supreme Grand Master. And on the right, the coat of arms, the actual emblem of the Knights Templar, is a red cross with the royal lion and unicorn behind it. Again, as we proceed through the presentation, these symbols will be thoroughly analyzed. At the bottom, the double cross of Lorraine, the color being red. Here, in a slightly more commercial corporate context, we have the flag of the British East India Company. Now there's a study. The British East India Company. Go to the encyclopedias, go to our work. We have lots of links, lots of information on these latter bodies. We can't delve into it in this presentation or we'd lose our context, but certainly have to emphasize at this point for people to make a study of these corporations that are headed by the royals, that are seated with elites, and which was responsible for basically genocidal acts, the wholesale conquest, colonization on a political, social level of the whole of the world, both East and West. So start getting into the encyclopedias, do your homework, look up British East India Company, Dutch East India Company, Virginia Company, Hudson Bay Company. And you're going to find that these are they're connected to groups that you may be familiar with, for instance, like the Russell Trust or the Skull and Bones Order, the Order of Death. These orders, like the Skull and Bones, are direct tentacles, branches of these companies that I mentioned. And find out how they monopolized sugar, tobacco, caffeine, mercury, opium, the whole dumbing down of people through these foodstuffs, through these stimulants. Well, who monopolized the trade of sugar and caffeine and tobacco? In the book Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, there's an extensive appendices section. And that appendices, that large appendices section, was put in the book absolutely deliberately. It was the result of many years of research, because my own work I knew would be very controversial when the time that it was published, for the time that it was published and put out, and it was. And therefore, a good deal of the book was these appendices with verifiable source materials. In other words, not from me, so that if anyone was to read my thesis and say, well, this too fringe, too way out, I presented a lot of appendices for people to look at, and look at all these divergent subject matter and come to the conclusion for themselves about whether my original thesis has any merit at all. But Appendix F needs to be mentioned at this point because it contains Valdemar Valerian's Master Chronology. And this is one of the most important documents probably that's ever been penned, ever been written. There are others like it, but this is just something really stupendous that in a most objective way helps you connect the dots and see what we're talking about when we're dealing with these royal-backed dynastic concerns like the Hudson Bay Company and the Virginia Company and the British East India Company. Just go to that Master Chronology and begin reading from when it starts, from the early centuries all the way down to the modern age. And just with the evidence of your own eyes and your own intelligence, you'll see something remarkable unfold. The history, the chronology of mass control. Here is a picture of Cross Hall at the White House. Not only is it the red carpet, which is alarming enough, since that should only be, that has historically only been used for royals. Why do we find it in a country that is meant to have fought against these dynastic concerns is worrisome enough. But the very fact that it's also called Cross Hall. Let's remember, symbol literacy, pattern recognition. Back to the Hyksos again. Their legacy in Egypt. Well, the Hyksos did not have a good reputation among the Egyptians, whose national traditions depicted them as plunderers of cities and temples, cruel and impious barbarians, faithful only to their god Seth, that variable incarnation of evil in the Osiris legend. So says Joseph Modrestewski in his book The Jews of Egypt, from Ramesses II to Emperor Hadrian. Ralph Ellis tells us that about the Exodus, the true Exodus. It's mentioned in the Bible, but what's the true historical data on that? He says, thus began an orgy of looting and violence as the departing Hyksos Israelites stripped the land bare. It was destruction on an unprecedented scale, and it prompted the Theban pharaoh, when he saw the ruins of Avaris, to declare that this was not just greed, but avarice. What happened after the Hyksos and the Atenists were cast out of Egypt? In the days of Akhenaten, the sun had moved from the sign of Taurus, the bull, into the sign or house of Aries, the lamb or the ram. And the priesthoods of Egypt were not all in agreement as to this movement or this position of the sun. The Hyksos kings and their people honored the astrological procession and began reverencing the traits and proclivities associated with the sign of Aries, whereas the priests of Thebes in southern or upper Egypt decided the time was not right for this and for new gods to be venerated. They wished to remain loyal to the quote-unquote Taurian principles, and we can't blame them. After the legacy, the ruin, the machinations, the insinuating treachery of the Atenists and what they had seen, after the depravity and mania of Akhenaten, we can hardly accept them to be sitting around the table, discussing the finer points of astrology and of the zodiac. So they wanted to return the land to a semblance of normality. One way to do that was to go back to the worship of the old gods and to establish patterns. Akhenaten, because he had invented and come up and conceived a new god, he had promoted a minor god to a higher status. Of course, they were going to be more fanatical about it, and they were not going to be inclusive, they were going to be exclusive. And so exclusive, in fact, that even during the time of their exile from Egypt, after the so-called Exodus, the true Exodus that is, they would even have schisms in their own company. The Atenists would finally even divide over this matter, as we'll see. This astrological phenomenon not only caused divisions amongst the priests and cult members within Egypt, but it was also the cause of division amongst the Atnists, the ones mentioned in the Old Testament fictive accounts as the 12 tribes of Israel. Ralph Ellis is convinced, as we are, that the so-called tribes divided over differences relating to the zodiac. The two hard-line tribes, known as Judites, repudiated and condemned those who dissented for all eternity, saying that they had broken the covenant, quote-unquote. The Bible scenes at Mount Sinai are fictive accounts of this time of argument and schism. That's right. The secret lies again in astrology or astrotheology. The Egyptians were of the stellar and solar cult, the movement of the sun, the movement of the moon, the movement of Sirius, the movement of constellations was of vital importance to them. They, like so many other races in the world, had divided their zodiac into the famous 12 houses, even though many other constellations and luminaries were noted. These were the gods. These were the original gods of the early schools. Now, due to the wobble of the axis of the Earth, the sun, moon, planets, and constellations appear to move backward through the 12 signs. The sun takes 2,160 years to traverse one sign of 30 degrees, moving 1 degree every 72 years. The entire cycle lasts 25,920 years. Which means that this slow procession, the sun moves through all the signs of the zodiac. It is now very close to the sign of Aquarius. It's not in Aquarius yet, but it's in the cusp, what is known as a cusp area. Here's another diagram that illustrates what we're talking about, a clock-like image of the zodiac. The small hand points to the sign of Aries there, and this sign of Aries was very important to the ancient Atnists because it's where Akhenaten conceived the whole cult of Aton. The cult of Aton took birth during the sign of Aries. It was just always symbolized by a ram or a lamb. But of course, 2,000 years or more have elapsed. In the introduction of this program, we said that we'd be dealing with a period about 1400 BC in Egypt. Well, we have moved on since that time. We're now at least 2,000 years on from that point. And so we are now moving, we've already moved out of the sign of Aries. And where the large hand on that diagram shows you, we've moved through the whole sign of Pisces, symbolized by the two fish, and are now at the cusp point, as I said, of the sign of Aquarius. And that little man with a water pitcher is the emblem or symbol, the famous symbol of the sign of Aquarius. But let us never forget that Christianity, Judaism, Atonism was conceived in the sign of Aries. This is a very important historical and mythological anecdote. It is one of the reasons why we see the lamb being used as a symbol of Christ, Agnus Dei. It's one of the symbols for the red cross of Set, because let us never doubt for a moment that that red cross is an astrological symbol, of course. It represents the crossing of the celestial equator and the ecliptic. But it is the tutelary emblem of the Atnists, the worshippers of the god Set. The ram, the lamb, where does that come from? As we said, it is the symbol of the sign of Aries. This all has to do with Egypt and what was happening in the stars and in the sky at the time of the reign of the Akhenaten. And as Jordan Maxwell and so many other ancient writers have gone into, it's all about astrotheology, stellar mythology, Christianity conceived in the sign of Aries, the symbol of light, the person of Jesus himself, his 12 disciples, and all the other adventures that take place that are fictively rendered in the Bible, the meeting at Mount Sinai, the burning bush, the Old Testament stories as well. It's all astrotheology, stellar mythology. It's dealt with in great depth in this book that we did on the subject of astrotheology and sidereal mythology. A close look at the Bible, a close look at all the Christian stories, the metaphors and their origins, going back to the famous cults of old, the cults of antiquity. Here again in Christian art, we see the solar Christ. The artist has emphasized that. He's emphasized the astro-theological, astro-mythological element here by having his figure hold the red cross. We see the trees, the old Druidic cult of the trees. We see the sleeping members in the foreground. These represent the 4 seasons. This is an astrological rendering. We have to understand that the whole Bible is an astrological rendering. The movement of the sun, and the emphasis has always been that Jesus, in exactly the same way as Mithras or Orpheus or Zoroaster, so many other mythological characters, Horus, Isis, Bacchus. The idea is that the hero is a rendition of the sun, or one of the important luminaries, and that his adventures from the time of his birth to his death are metaphors for astrological phenomena. John E. Remsburg, in his monumental book, The Christ, says that Charles Francois Dupois, in his Origins of Worship, one of the most elaborate and remarkable works on mythology ever penned, shows that nearly all the religions of the world, including Christianity, were largely derived largely from solar worship. Again, we don't have to take any writer's word for it. Let's just look at the imagery. Just look at the solar cult imagery. Still in evidence today. Manly Palmer Hall wrote, "The adoration of the sun was one of the earliest and most natural forms of religious expression. Complex modern theologies are merely involvements and amplifications of this single aboriginal belief." Now, the Hyksos, we talked about the Hyksos being defined or symbolized by the serpent, the dragon, by the god Set, by the red cross, and even the lion, the hybrid lion of Atonism. We looked at the symbol of the sun and the rays of the sun, and of course the pyramid, but the pyramid doubles up as the Knights of Malta cross. We also have to know that they were known as the Shasu, meaning shepherd kings. We know that the Pharaoh, in depictions, holds the shepherd's crook. We see that Jesus, the Christian Christ, and the Pope of Rome use that same crozier shape. Jesus Christ is the basis of the Christian religion, and he was referred to as the shepherd. He was even visited by 3 shepherds. Is this code to show that he was descended from the Egyptian pharaohs known as the shepherd kings? Did it have to do with him being a master whose teachings were being carried over from the age of Aries into that of Pisces? And turning to Freemasonry again. Aries, the Masonic lambskin. Masons wearing the apron, the Passover ritual, and the idea of the lamb's blood. But these Masonic symbols and emblems, they just appear to be mumbo-jumbo to those who are on the outside. Does anybody question where all of this comes from, and why so many degrees of Masonry feature Judaic names and titles? George Washington, President Truman, seen here wearing the lambskin, replete with symbols. And it would be fine if these symbols were confined merely to the enclaves of Freemasonry, but they're not. They're to be found in every boulevard, every city, and every major town of the world. They're found in religion, and they're found in politics. Now, losing his mighty empire was no small upset. The humiliation and indignity was undoubtedly felt very poignantly by the Atonist king, who could not fathom why he had been so maligned and misunderstood. We know this about psychopaths and maniacs. The one thing we know about the psychopath or the sociopath, what used to be called sociopath, anyone with a severe mental derangement or schizoid personality, we understand that everyone else is to blame. It's old, it's new, but everyone else is to blame. Their view of the past is often very shaky, highly edited, spurious, and should any kind of upset come to them, or any kind of tragedy, in the mind of the psychopath, nothing they've done is always at fault. In fact, They overemphasize their own goodness, their own traits, their own worth, completely against what the record is. But fundamentally, in the life of a psychopath, if they are ever thrown out of office or ever suffer any kind of downsizing, everyone else is to blame. And this is no different with the ancient tyrant Akhenaten. We can surmise that from his broken throne and dark halls of exile, his confusion turned to hatred for the world and for mankind. All that mattered was revenge and the reconquest of the world. In our work, we stress that this is the origin of the New World Order. So when you see that term under a pyramid, sacred to Egypt, sacred to the pharaohs, when you even see that term at all, New World Order, it implies that there was an old world disorder. Throughout the Bible, throughout Judaism, there's a tremendous contempt for Egypt. Egypt is downplayed continually throughout the Bible and has been thought of very negatively by anyone who's an advocate of religion. Of course, that flies in the face of the magnificence that we see when we go there, or anybody who looks at the place objectively. Something doesn't seem right with this antipathy that the biblicists, the writers of the Old and New Testament, seem to have towards the land. But from what we're explaining in this presentation, we can understand it. We can understand the conflict between the Atenists and the Ammonists, and the great antipathy of the Atenists, particularly after their exile for Egypt. In Isaiah 19, we sense this, that this is a subtext. The burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence. And the heart of Egypt shall meet in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they will fight every one against his brother, and every one against his neighbor. And the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof. So the Atenists breeding conflict. Well, that's exactly what the ancient records show, particularly during the exile period of Akhenaten, particularly during the reign of Tutankhamun, particularly during the reign of the pharaoh Haremheb, who was an Ammonist, and how the Atenists tried to unseat him, and how they tried to dupe him, and how they tried to embroil Haremheb and his Egypt in foreign wars by stirring up neighboring tribes like the Hittites. We have the information in the Irish Origins book. Makes fascinating reading. It's an old story of internecine troubles and fighting and treachery. From the Hebrew Torah, He shall deliver their kings into thine hand, and thou shalt destroy their name from them. Ye shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which ye shall possess serve their gods. So you're not going to enter in as confederates. You're not going to empower and enlighten anymore. You're going to wipe out and destroy. Read the first 5 books of the Bible that make up the Hebrew Torah, or the Jewish Torah. Read the catalog of genocide and mayhem and mass murder. You're going to utterly destroy, not utterly enlighten. Looking at the duplicitous Flavius Josephus Piso again, the so-called Jewish historian. What does he write in his books? It reeks with contempt for Egypt and for the Ammonists. He writes, when time had obliterated the benefits of Joseph, and the kingdom of Egypt had passed into another family, they inhumanely treated the Israelites and wore them down in various labors. For they ordered them to divert the course of the river, that's the Nile, into many ditches, and to build walls and raise mounds, by which to confine the inundations of the river. And moreover, vexed our nation in constructing foolish pyramids, forced them to learn various arts, and inured them to undergo great labors. And after this manner they did, for 400 years, undergo bondage. The Egyptians doing that to destroy the Israelites by overmuch labor. So there's the origin of it all. There's the origin of the lie of slavery that even the top Jewish scholars say didn't happen. There is no evidence for it. There's no evidence for such oppression. There were times when the Egyptians used slavery, but that was usually directly after a war in which the captives were used to clean up the mess, so to speak. But there was no prolonged hundreds of years of confinement, and we could elaborate on this ad infinitum, but We refer you again to the books and to the sources that we mentioned so that you can corroborate this. Because many of these entries, many of these statements about Egypt are absolutely nothing more than propaganda. Let's continue with our look at the destruction of the Druids. Continue with that into the story of the Scythians and my theories regarding this group of people from Europe, the Scythians. The traditions of Irish Druidism, as I point out in the books, had spread to Egypt with the Iberu, that's the original Hebrew, of course, in primordial times. And we stated that the Iberu or the Aberu were the original men of the river, the men of fire, the great adepts from Hibernia, from Iberia. The Druids were collaborators, we pointed out, with the Egyptian Ammonists. And the civilizations of Syria, Greece, Egypt, and India may have been situated topographically in the eastern hemisphere of the globe, but this means little. What matters is where the inhabitants of these climes received their cultural and spiritual elements. This is the truth that must never be revealed to the world. So if we read about Irish culture, we're bound to read of its eastern origins. Over and over again, authors persist in rehashing this falsehood. They emphasize later migrations that occurred a long time after the rise of the original Irish empires of knowledge. And Commons Beaumont, in his book The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain, deals with this whole question. He says, the ancient civilization of the land we call Egypt has been pronounced by archaeologists as flawless of its type from the very first. It reveals none of the painful steps from primeval beginnings passing through the Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age to that of iron. It apparently burst upon the scene into exotic radiance, its perfected civilization accordingly having been described as a miracle. Science cannot admit any such miracle, and another explanation must be forthcoming. And Sir J. Maspero, in his book The Dawn of Civilization, wrote, what were the people by whom it, that is Egyptian civilization, was developed? The country whence they came, the race to which they belonged, is today unknown. And I wrote, a major area of our work concerns the connections between Ireland and Egypt. There were connections between these two lands from the remotest periods. At a later date, Celts from Europe, known in Irish mythology and in history as the Gaels, also frequented Egypt. This group that had traveled as far as the Indus Valley have gone by the name Scythians. They were the ancestors of the Sarmatians. They have other names, one of which was Messe Getae. The Scythians were, in our estimation, displaced to Europe after the Age of Catastrophe. After their sojourn in Egypt, and after teaming up with the Atenists, some of their horde made their way back west. The Scythians re-enter Irish history as the so-called Milesians. Now this is why we dealt with the whole Age of Catastrophe earlier on in this presentation, because it's fundamental to understand that there was a displacement. So therefore, when you hear about Amorites, and when you hear about Babylonians, and when you hear about Sumerians, or the Scythians, or the Sarmatians, or the Messe Getae, and for that matter even of the Cretans and the Philistines, and certainly when you hear about the Hyksos, when you hear about any of these groups, the Hittites, the Hurrians, you have to realize that when history starts speaking of them, some groups are portrayed as nomadic, and others are ensconced in a particular area. But we have to understand that there was an age of catastrophe, a worldwide cataclysm. You don't stay put when that happened. We've already emphasized that the lands of Britain were pretty much deserted, evacuated. Same thing went for Europe. So where an official history says that a certain group had their territory, how do we know that that's true? They may have had multiple territories. They may have intermixed. It's not necessarily so easy to identify their actual homelands and their actual natural habitats. And this is very much the case with the Scythians, who technically are said to have existed in Russia, north of Anatolia, which is Turkey, but that they also had many communities elsewhere, as far away as Galilee and into Egypt. The Sarmatians, the Scythians, would have found it easy, and we have to find it understandable, that these horseback riding Scythians could easily have found their way, as they did, into Asia Minor, and from there it's a step away to Egypt. Now, within the last 10 years or so, authors such as Ralph Ellis, Mustafa Gadala, and Ahmed Osman, following on from masters such as Commons Beaumont, Immanuel Velikovsky, Sigmund Freud, and others, have uncovered the close ties between the Hyksos and the so-called Israelites of the Old Testament. We advocate the Israelites, or Hyksos, to have been none other than the Scythians of Europe, who were, we believe, displaced from Britain during the Great Age of Catastrophe. We advocate the Scythians to be the same shepherd kings of foreign lands that the historians have been so hard-pressed to identify. We believe the Scythians had many communities in Egypt, just as they had further east. And of course we make that point that this is a later migration. It's not the same migration west, it's not the same migration east of the Iberu. The original megalithic movement of the Druids into Egypt, their confederacy with the Ammonists, is of a previous or earlier time than the movement of the Scythians. However, the Scythian movement is still a west to east movement. So even if you don't want to accept that the ancient Irish of the Mesolithic and the megalithic period moved out of their habitats as the great wise ones and moved east into Samaria, Babylon, Egypt, and so on, even if that's too heavy, although we believe that evidence is coming out all the time that shows us this is perfectly legitimate. But even if you find that too heavy, just look at the later movement of the Scythians. These are Celts, these are Gaels. These are people, I believe, were displaced from Ireland and set up their new center, their new habitats, where the historians know that they did. Turkey, Anatolia, steppes of Russia, etc. From there, we entertain the idea that they entered into Egypt. That's still a west to east movement. So whichever way you cut it, we've got to entertain this idea that the cultural elements, whether they came with the ancient Irish or whether they came with the Scythians in a later date, the movement is still from west to east. And when we see those symbols reappearing in Europe, they were brought back by the same cult and its descendants, by the same sect, by the same people, the same nations, the descendants of those nations, returning again to the ancestral homes. Now, if the Scythians and Hyksos used the title Israelite, and that's a big if, but if they did, it is probably because this was the name of the ancient Irish Iessa, or Issa, the god of light. If the name Issa is combined with the name Ra, one derives Isra, or Isra, which can soon be rendered Israel. The phoneme L means ministers, or messengers of. Iessa was lord of light, and Ra, or Amun-Ra, was also. The combination of names by members of the solar cult is perfectly understandable. There is nothing unfathomable about the matter. And we add that there was a Scythian capital at Galilee. It was known as Scythopolis. You can even find maps that show it. In ancient times it was actually known as Beth Shean, which has always sounded to me like a very Gaelic term, by the way. Max L. de Mont, one of these Jewish historians I've been mentioning, in his book Jews, God, and History, he says that in Genesis, the book dealing with their history, the history of the Israelites, that he means, before their entry into Egypt, the Jews are, with one exception, referred to as Hebrews, not as Israelites. After their exodus from Egypt, and in other books of Moses, the Jews are referred to mostly as Israelites, very seldom as Hebrews. After the Exodus, it is the pagans who usually refer to the Jews as Hebrews, whereas the Jews usually refer to themselves as Israelites. Now that would be incomprehensible gobbledygook unless we take on board what we've been saying in this presentation. Of course, when the wise ones entered Egypt and when they were known to the Ammonists of old. From primordial times, they knew that they were Hebrews because that is a term that has nothing to do with how it was later used. That's the problematic term. It doesn't make sense until you know its original meaning, its original denotative meaning. The term Israelite, we've explained, comes in afterwards, after the Exodus. But the Exodus is not of Jews. The Exodus is of the Hyksos people. Extreme royalty, elites of Egypt. Not leaving of their own kind, of their own will, not going on vacation, but thrown out of Egypt because of the tyrannous actions and activities. These come into history, these people enter into history, and are often known as by the Israelites. But where did that term come from? Is that a Scythian Celtic term, referring to the god of the ancient Celts and the ancient Gaels and the ancient Irish, Iasa? Now, of course, Scythian itself is a later derivation. The Scythians refer to themselves as the Saka, S-A-C-A, S-A-K-A, or the Saga, S-A-G-A. It did not mean men of the spears or of the blades, as we've been told. It actually meant the stag men. The word sage, meaning wise ones, magicians, or adepts, comes from this root. And so does the word sacred or sacrament come from this word, Saka. And it's very close to the word Zaka, with a Z that meant the stag. And also horned animals like the goat. That term for the eastern Scythians were known as Mesagete. That is a word that contains the word roots for the word goat, the Get, or the Goths, because the Goths were linked to these Gaels. They were linked to the Scythians. And they worshipped the horned animals, the vegetarian horned animals. They were the sages, the wise ones. In fact, the word Saxon also derives from this. The Scythians were ancestors of the so-called Anglo-Saxons. The biblical name Isaac also derives from Saka. It is correctly rendered Ish-Sak, Ish in Hebrew meaning man, Sak meaning Scythian, so it means man of the Saka, the wise man. The Proto-Greeks were known as Archaeans. Could this be a corruption of Sacaeans? If you put the S on the beginning of the word, that's what it shows you. In fact, one of the Buddha's main titles was Shaka. So it means the wise ones, the sages, the adepts. And the story of the Scythians is gone into in Volume 1 of the Irish Origins of Civilization, in the chapters entitled The Milesians, because, as I said, the Scythians were known as the Milesians when they enter Irish history. What a fascinating story. It shows the incredible story of the Scythians, how they got displaced from Ireland, which is unique to my work, and shows how they returned. But when they returned, unfortunately, a large group of them were allied to these Egyptian pharaohs. And the story in the book shows you how they first went to Egypt, what prompted them to go there, a little bit of what happened when they were there, how they got tied in with Akhenaten's group, and how, again, they were exiled, finally. They took the side of the Atenists, and their confederation or collaboration is essential. And most importantly, though, I identify the Scythians absolutely with the Hyksos, because every scholar has a different idea. They can't make up their minds whether the Hyksos were Cretans, whether they were Philistines, whether they were Amorites from the Babylonian area. Some people have even said they were Hindus from India, Hurrians, and so forth. So, there's no consensus here. But to me, the evidence, especially when you dip into the Irish records, and you look at who these people were, and you examine these word roots, there's strong evidence to suppose that the Scythian horsemen were the ones who entered into Egypt as the Hyksos, or at the very least, they were closely allied. Now, the myths tell us that after a prolonged stay in Egypt, the Scythians decided to return to the west. The records tell us how they made their way to Scythia. They made their way back to their homeland. And then eventually, their descendants spread out to Spain. On their travels, they were not alone. They brought with them the sons and daughters of the Hyksos Atenist nobles with whom they were allies. This ancient connection between the Scythian Celts, or Scythian Gaels, and the Egyptian Atenists is crucial to an understanding of the destruction of the Druids and the conquest of Ireland. Their departure from Egypt was not a benign affair, as the historians relate. It was an expulsion. The Scythians were part of the house of Akhenaten, or the biblical Moses. They were departing the land with their leader, the broken king, the man without an empire. Here is the truth behind the ever-problematic story of the exiled tribes of Israel. A decoding of Irish mythology, together with a study of ancient texts, lead us to understand how the land of Ireland fell out of the hands of the gods into the hands of the mortals. And this is directly from Irish legends and mythologies that talk about this, that how the land fell out of the hands of the gods. We understand that the country's priestesses were predicting the decline of the Golden Age and the rise of another age dominated by spiritless people committed to debauchery, treachery, and evil. This evil, quote-unquote, was the consequence of the intrigues of those eastern invaders who belligerently conquered the land of Ireland, taking it as a replacement for their long-lost Egyptian thrones. So Britain, Ireland, Wales, right? Britain is made up of several countries, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. The British Isles, upon which the sun never sets. Did the Milesian, Atenist, Scythian, Hyksos kings and their descendants decide that they'd move west to conquer ancestral homes, the place of the ancient Druid forefathers, and make that the fount of their new empire? After all, it was the fount of wisdom. It was the land, the seat of religion. Well, that's what we're reading about when we read about these invasions to Ireland. The truth can now be told. Well, there is no doubt in our minds that Ith, Ur, Mil, Don, and Heber, namely the Milesians, were related, either by blood or ideology, to the Egyptian cult of Aton. It is these demagogues who sought to raise their own Davidic thrones upon those of the Druids, in a mineral-wealthy, strategically well-placed, climatically temperate island, known to them from their own childhoods as the Fortunate Lands in the west, those beyond the Pillars of the Giants. And that, of course, refers not to the Straits of Gibraltar. No, it refers to the Giant's Causeway, as a matter of fact, in Northern Ireland. The true Pillars of Hercules, the true Pillars of the Giants, up in Hyperborea. Another lie has been told to us about this anecdote, whether you're reading Plato or whoever, and they're talking about the famous Pillars of Hercules. Well, Hercules was simply based on the old god Ogma. But Ogma was an Irish god. And don't take my word for it. Go to people like Fraser and Robert Graves and so many of the other great mythologists. It's conclusively understood that Hercules was a later rendition of the Irish Ogma and other gods. Well, Ogma's Irish. So the Pillars of Hercules are the Pillars of Ogma, god of strength, god of Ireland. Once you understand what Hyperborea represents, what part of the world it was situated in, then the mysteries are cleared up. But you can do more than that. You can go and look at them. You can go and take a photograph of them. In fact, thousands of people do every day without realizing it. Go to Northern Ireland. And on the west coast of Scotland, the same forms, the same beautiful hexagonal rocks are to be seen. On the east coast of Ireland and on the west coast of Scotland are these pillars that the mariners knew when they passed through them. They referred to them as the Pillars of the Giants. The first king of the first dynasty of Egypt had made his way to Ireland, where he lies interred. And he was not the only Egyptian to embark upon such a voyage. The connections between the two lands have been well obscured, as we have said. But in ancient times men did not fear to fall off the edge of the world if they traveled far to the west. On the contrary, they knew that the great masters and astronomers of the world resided in the west. But this is the bunkum, the mumbo-jumbo we're given. The earth is flat. You're going to fall off the edge of the world. It's a realm of monsters and demons and otherworldly specimens. Look at what we've believed. Look at what we have bought into and how it contradicts with the truth of the matter. Now the Atnas believed they would be welcomed in the land of their ancestors. However, they were wrong. We suppose the Druids chose to remain loyal to the Ammonist pharaohs of Egypt and that after hearing of Akhenaten's heresy and belligerence against the old gods and the Egyptian people, they warily denied the Atenists entry into their land. As a result of this rejection, the Atenists regarded the Druids in a similar light as the Ammonists. They reacted with open war. Now we're talking official Irish history here, because that's exactly what happened. In the story of the Milesians, when they arrive, their king Ith is pretty much the first one to approach the Irish kings at Derry in the north of Ireland. Well, they didn't like the guy. They suspected something was up, and they basically had him murdered. I think it's because they were on alert. They already knew that these Scythians, that were once Irishmen like themselves, were hand in hand with these Atenists, that they worshipped a corrupted form of solar religion, and that they had despoiled, laid wreck and ruin to Egypt. And therefore the Druids, being confederates of the Ammonists, were on guard. And this is exactly corroborated in the story of the Milesian approach, their approach of the Irish kings, and immediately that they were in a state of rivalry and conflict. Now, an important king of the Scythians, who ruled during the time when people crossed, when the Scythians crossed from Scythia into Spain and then from Spain to Ireland, was known as Mile, M-I-L-E, King Mile. His people have been referred to by historians as the Milesians. This may be the origin of the word militia, meaning armed man. Mile's wife, Mile is a very interesting character, and Mile's wife is one of the most important figures in Irish and Scottish history, because she was none other than Meritaten, the lost daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Her name meant the beloved one of Aton. The word Mary, M-E-R-I or M-E-R-Y, depending on which scholar is translating the hieroglyphics, can even be rendered M-A-R-Y, Mary. It can even be rendered M-E-R-R-Y, merry, like having a merry old time, or Robin Hood and his merry men and all of that. Meri is an Egyptian word, and it meant beloved one, favored one. Aten, in Meri Aten, it's obvious, it's Aton, the sun. So here we have a leading regent, no less the daughter, and some historians think no, it's the granddaughter, but nevertheless, Meritaten, beloved of Aton, married to the king of the Scythians, descend upon Ireland. More importantly, her nickname was Scota, S-C-O-T-A. She gave her name to Ireland, and then later, after Irish in ancient times moved into Scotland, Scotland took the name, and it still preserves her name today, Scotland. Scotland named after Scotia, named after an Egyptian princess. King Menes, as we said, the first king of the first official dynasty of Egypt. This is about 3,000-4,000 years BC. King Menes. Is he buried in Egypt? No. Where is he buried? Knockmany in Ireland. What's that all about? The story is to be told. The story, we have the information that the Egyptians, whether it's the baboon that have been discovered at Navan Fort, these are Barbary apes. Barbary apes known only in the East, turn up in Ireland, and so forth and so on. The connections are there. But this is a very specific connection regarding Scota. Ralph Ellis, in his book Scota, the Queen of the Scots, says that Ireland was originally called Scota before the 3rd century AD, and that is fairly well known. Amongst others, Claudian, Orosius, Marianus, Scotus, Isidore, and Bede all mention that Ireland was called Scota. So the question arises as to whether she was making a return to the homeland of her own mother, Nefertiti. As we said in an earlier part of this presentation, the pale features, the aquiline features, the dearth of information about Nefertiti's ancestry, and also what happened to her after the reign of the Atenists, because she fell away. Perhaps she fell out of favor with the Atenists. But of her 6 daughters, 4 were killed in a famine. 4 died in a famous famine that swept Egypt. And Scota, Meritaten, disappears also from the historical record until we find out that from the Scottish and Irish records, she accompanied King Mile. So the question arises, was she making a return to the homeland of her mother? In any case, since Gotha was a direct descendant of the chief Atnists of Egypt and one of their highest dignitaries, it follows that her husband, Mil, regardless of what country he actually came from, was certainly a member of the solar cult. Now the Milesians are better known to historians as the Gaels, and that word comes from Goidels or Goidelics. In Latin, Anglo-Saxon, Welsh, German, and Irish, Gael, G-A-L, meant foreigner or stranger. The Gaels were therefore considered, by those they supplanted, to be unrelated, strange, and different. As we will see, it was these Atnists who were responsible for the conquest of Ireland and the gradual appropriation of the sacred traditions. Their descendants were also responsible for the economic rape of Britain. As we approach the Christian era, we pick up the trail of the Milesian Atnists in the guise of the so-called Chaldees, or Chaldean monks, that historians are wont to believe were ostensibly Christians. Christian lore tells that the Chaldeans were persecuted and eradicated because they were apparently contaminated by pagan ways. The leaders of the Chaldeans were the educators of Europe's nobility. The Chaldeans were closely associated with the Knights Templars and the Cistercians. We've had to fast forward a bit there for time and brevity. Of course, we tell the story of the Milesians in greater depth in the Volume 1 of the Irish Origins of Civilization. But isn't it interesting that after they arrive in Ireland, about 600 BC, 500 BC, and when we fast forward to the time of Christianity, 33 AD, moving up to about 600 AD, we come across a group of people called the Chaldeans, who historians believe are a blend between the old pagan Druidism and the Christianity that came later. This is what British Israelites, for instance, are wont to believe. When we read official historical accounts, we're told this. In fact, we're told that the blending of the Christians with the Druids was a pretty much amicable affair. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The word Chaldee can still be seen in many, many word roots throughout Ireland and England. For instance, Kirk, Chaldee in Scotland. Kirk is church, and Chaldee means the Chaldees. The Chaldees were a large group of monks. After the age of the Gaels, that's the Milesians, the official history books tell us that there were at least 4 other important waves of visitation. We are told that there was a group known as the Picts, who finally ended up in Scotland, but whose relics can be found all over Ireland and Britain. We have the famous Britons, another wave that came after the Gaels. More correctly, they're known as Brythonic Celts, probably or possibly related to these Gaels. And they arrived about 500 BC to England. We have the Belgae. Ostensibly, allegedly, they're Belgian Celts who crossed over during the time of Julius Caesar. And we have the Caledonians. This is a Roman term for tall, red-haired Germans related to the Belgae and the Picts. They gave their name, Caledonia, to ancient Scotland. Now, after the alleged arrival of the Belgae, Britain was to become a province of the Roman Empire. The Romans, brutal and cruel as they were, made expert use of complicit, sycophantic British puppet chieftains to rule the tribes in their name. Some of these vassals were loyal to the Roman emperors and were subsequently awarded power and riches for services rendered. After the Roman Empire collapsed, due to the spread of quote-unquote barbaric tribes, Britain was conquered by Norwegian Vikings, by Danish Jutes, and Germanic Saxons. It was during and after this wave of invasion and settlement that Britain became known as Anglo-Saxons, or the English from Angleland. The Anglo-Saxon settlement occurred in the 5th century AD, about 200 years after the arrival of Christianity. H.R. Ellis Davidson, in his book Myths and Symbols in Pagan Europe, he wrote, in the 5th century, a mixture of tribes generally known as the Angles and Saxons came to England and settled in the south and east, driving much of the Celtic population westward into Wales and Cornwall. Robert Siblurard, in Keepers of the Secrets, says the Saxon invasion of Celtic lands eliminated the memory of the Druids. So when we're talking about the destruction of the megalithic Irish, the original aboriginal ancestral peoples and their priestarchy, the Druids, we're talking about waves, successive waves of attack and annihilation. It did not all happen in one phase. There were several levels to this, several moments in history in which this primeval race came under threat. Geoffrey Keating, in his book The History of Ireland, from the earliest period to the English invasions, this is a book published about 1629, he said that there are some authors among the ancients that make false statements with respect to the Irish, particularly Strabo, who asserts in his third book that the Irish live upon human flesh. My answer to this charge is that Strabo has lied in thus asserting the Irish to be cannibals. For nowhere in our Irish records do we read of any person that eats human flesh. My answer to St. Jerome, who makes the same assertion, is that he must have had this information from some vendor of lies, and that it should not be credited to the prejudice of the Irish. But that opens many doors. This is an understatement. In the presentation's introduction, we talked about that, the various forms of colonization, and we mentioned that it was social and political and involving military action, and we also mentioned that it was psychic. But when it comes to the Irish, when it comes to these vendors of lies, there is no end to it. And one of the campaigns of colonialization, when you're going to invade a people, is to spread all manner of physical and written poison and fiction. So most of what we hear about the Druids, particularly these scandalous accusations, are nothing more than lies, propaganda. It's the lie machinery. Peter Beresford, in his book of the Druids, he says, the curious fact is that no insular Celtic literature nor tradition provides evidence for the practice of human sacrifice as a religious rite. Philip Freeman, in the book The Philosopher and the Druids, wrote that Posidonius also notes that the Druid sacrifice condemned criminals. Posidonius states that the Gauls will keep a criminal under guard for 5 years, then impale him on a pole in honor of their gods. They will then burn his body on an enormous pyre, along with the first fruits of the land. But this particular rite of human sacrifice seems to have occurred only once every 5 years as part of a harvest festival. It was not a daily slaughter for some bloodthirsty god, but an exceptional effort at restoring balance to nature for the good of the tribe. So we find out the facts. We find out the actual truth. That sacrifice was involved, but it was of criminals, inveterate criminals who violated the code of the people, who stole, raped, murdered, and didn't deserve life. This is how the Druids dealt with them. Is that any worse than what we experience today, with thousands of people who are innocent being treated in an abominable way? But see, these ancient historians had an agenda. This is what we always have to face and always have to remember. Most of them were patronized by the same plutocratic, oligarchical concerns that we've been addressing in this whole presentation, and that I labor in my works to always remind the human race are still in existence today. Their descendants are still around today. So we have a lie machinery at work, and it's very important for sanity, for true understanding of history, for true understanding of the world, to understand this and to be able to be immune to it and analyze it. For the simple reason is that it continues today. The same lie machinery is in work today. It's still being propagated today. This is why we need to be very, very astute when we read newspapers and magazines and accounts of history and what people's beliefs are. There's an Orwellian lie machinery at work. John O'Mahony, in his book The History of Ireland, says that against no class of her people did the English law rage with more violence than against the bards and the Shanachis, and none were hunted down more relentlessly by the bloodhound myrmidons of our tyrants. In fact, it was necessary for the perpetration of their wholesale plunder and for the imposition of feudal landlordism in the place of the tribe's ownership of the Gaels, that the members of the free clans could not be reminded of their pedigree, recited by the professional historians. For this purpose they did seek, and do still seek, to demoralize and brutalize our noble race. So what he's saying here is that the bards, who were an integral part of the Druidic order, were mercilessly hunted down and destroyed. The bards were the keepers of the records. They were the keepers of the lineage. They knew about the racial heritage of the kings and the chieftains. So if you were some chieftain or prince or duke and you wanted to know about your family and you needed a refresher or a reminder of who exactly your family was, how far back in time it went, what other cousins and related dynasties throughout the world may have been involved with your family, and all of this kind of thing that we take for granted today. Well, they didn't have computer programs and they didn't have genealogists in the sense that we have today. They'd call in the bards who had mentally remembered all of this, who were experts in this. So of course when the colonialists came in, when the invaders came in, they absolutely targeted the bards. And today we have this romantic idea of what the bards were, and they were harpists and they were these sort of soothsayers and poets. But they also had a tremendous political function. And so they were sought out, and within just a few years, a very short period of time, they were annihilated. This is the kind of thing that spurred me to want to talk about this subject. I was sick and tired of opening books and finding that the destruction, the wholesale genocide of the Irish elite, some of the most spiritual men who've ever walked the planet, deserves nothing more than a few lines, a paragraph, and then turn the page, we're on to something else. James Bonwick, in Irish Druids and Old Irish Religions, published in 1894, or 1894, says that the statutes of Kilkenny, which were put in place by Edward III, made it penal to entertain any Irish bard. But Munster bards continued to hold their annual sessions to an early part of the last century. Carolan, the old blind harper, he was called last of the bards, he died in about 1738. So we're talking about a campaign of genocide and annihilation and cannibalization and plagiarism and suppression. We're talking 18th century here. Well, wait a minute. First we were talking about 600 BC. This thing is very long in the making. We have the Milesians, Atnists coming, and it's these people's descendants who would, of course, been by that time religiously Christian after AD 33, whatever. So we're talking about a wholesale campaign. It takes a long time to suppress a people, especially those as ardent as the ancient Irish. And sometimes when you hear the term being used Celtic or you hear Gaelic, sometimes scholars use those wrongly, because the Gaels are officially the Milesians. They're officially the oppressors. We're identifying these people and their descendants as the oppressors of the original megalithic Irish. So when you're looking into the timelines and when you're looking into the chronology and when you're looking into the identity of these different Irish groups, whether it's the Caledonians or the Belgae, you see, or the Britons or the Gaels or the Celts, one has to sort of get a profile on who we're talking about here. And that's what the books go into. Volume 1 will clearly profile, as best as we can anyway, who these people were. And if you're up on this subject and you've tracked it long enough, you'll find out that very few of these so-called Celtic scholars can find a consensus. Every few years they're changing their definition of what a Celt is, or where the Celts lived, or where the Celts stayed, or what kind of blood type they have, or what kind of language they spoke. So it appears to be a welter of information. Now St. Patrick burned whole libraries upon his arrival in Ireland. He was an agent, like St. Columba, sent to eliminate the Druids so that few would trace the origins of the world's educators. We saw in the last slide also that the eradication had also intentionality behind it, meaning that as long as the pure, pristine, unadulterated church or college of the Druids and the bards, the Shinachis, the minstrels, as long as that existed, there was no chance for the other thing, that other monstrosity, out of Egypt, out of Atanism, out of Rome. There's no chance of that ever getting seated and rooted. So the order of business was to eradicate everything that was there before. Not eradicate it so much that you couldn't plagiarize it, but as I said, that campaign of plagiarization and of appropriation is not done overnight. It actually takes hundreds of years to do that, to sift through the plunder, to arrange it, and to finally hybridize it, repackage it, and make it your own. So we're talking in the region of about 600 years here, 600 to 1,000 years. But the main thing is that no matter how long it takes, it has to happen. You have to eradicate the unadulterated form first. You have to wipe away all trace. Well, didn't the Atenists do this to the Amonist temples in Egypt, in their own land? Didn't they despoil and destroy? It's business as usual when they arrive in the West. That's right. We've heard about it. St. Patrick arriving in Ireland at quite a late date, after Christianity. Still, we hear him talking about casting out serpents, until we realize, of course, what he meant by that, or what the scriptwriters and mythmongers meant by that. They weren't talking about physical snakes. They were talking about the Irish druids, the Irish bards, who refer to themselves as the Nadreds or the Adders, meaning the serpents. The symbol was universal. We find it on the headgear of the pharaohs, and we find it in Ireland. The Druids, the Ammonists, the Alchemists, the Nissi, the Nashon, the Nagas, the Orphites, being wiped out by a despotic form of the Brotherhood of the Snake. Now, in the 12th century, when the English king Henry II decided to invade Ireland, he had to ask permission from the Roman Pope of the time, Adrian IV, who granted him his wish after clearly establishing who it was that was to rule Ireland for all time. In the words of Pope Adrian IV, he says, "It is not doubted, and you know it, that Ireland and all those islands which have received the faith belong to the Church in Rome. If you wish to enter that island, to drive vice out of it, to cause law to be obeyed, and St. Peter's pence to be paid by every house, it will please us to assign it to you." So when we're talking about double-headed eagles and monarchic control versus theocratic control, this is what we mean. The king is on his knees before the Pope. The king is asking permission. He's got the swords, he's got the army, but he's asking permission from the theocrats of the world. And so the control mechanism, this ordo ab chao situation, exists today. The ideological takeover, the eradication of the old ways, the supplanting of a religion, a Chaldean religion, a form of Christianity that would appeal to the people because it was in fact hybridized from ancient Ammonism and ancient Druidism. You wipe out the original, but you've got the copy, you've got the facsimile. And you repackage that and you put it in front of the people, and they're mind controlled into believing that this is still authentic. And from that point on, you proceed. You have people completely under your power. Colonization. Terry Jones, in his work The Primitive Celts, he wrote, "It seems to me the Celtic world is not so much a world that has been lost as a world that was deliberately obliterated by a ruthless empire." And how right he was, because that basically sums up the whole situation. Look at the Bible's passages. Let's reread them with an understanding of what we're talking about. For instance, Ezekiel 17. "I, the Lord, have brought down the high tree," which I believe means the Druids and the Egyptian Magi of old. "Have exalted the low tree," which I believe refers to the Atenists. "I have dried up the green tree," that again refers to the Druids, "and have made the dry tree to flourish. I, the Lord," and I believe that means Aton, the Lord of Judaism and Christianity, "I, the Lord, have spoken and have done it." The historian, Roman historian Tacitus, says, "If you want to rule the world, the whole world, does it follow that everyone else welcomes enslavement? To robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name freedom. They make a wilderness and call it peace." While recounting the story of the children of Meal, a few historians remind us that having defeated the Tuatha De Danann, that's the High Druids of Ireland, the brothers Eber and Erimon, each desiring to be kings over Ireland, fell to quarrelling and fighting. They admit that the so-called historical cycle of Ireland opened with divisiveness and conflict. Humans had defeated the gods, Atonism had defeated paganism, and the rivers ran with blood. Here's a little timeline, again to keep us aware of the historical process. Akhenaten's reign is thought to have ended about 1336 BC. Allegedly he attempted to return and seize power again under the reign of the Amonist king Seti I, around about 1290 to 1279 BC. There's even a record of this time saying that the Shasu, or the exiles, were busy making trouble for the king. However, Seti dealt with them by basically eradicating the threat once and for all. The Egyptian people did not want this demagogue back in power. Then we have the building of the Temple of Solomon, allegedly around 957 BC. We have the so-called captivity of the 12 tribes of Israel, around about 722 BC by the Assyrians, and then by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Then we find these Judites, or more correctly the Atnists, dispersing and moving westward, as we talked about, probably around about 550 BC. They moved to Scythia, of course, as we said. They moved to Spain, possibly France. And by the time they get round to conquering and attacking Ireland, it's probably around 500 BC. That's the 6th century BC. There's infighting amongst themselves, and dynastic rivalry persists. Of course, this is an old story. And they also would have had to put up with continued resistance from the Irish and Scottish and British Druids. They also then have the Roman invasion under Augustus in 34 BC, and then again under Julius Caesar in 55 BC. There's a lot of British history starts at this point. There's difficulty conquering Scotland, and we have Hadrian's Wall in the period after that. And then we basically have the Christ and the Christianity story beginning. And of course, under that, I've always insisted that we are talking about Atnists when we're talking about the Chaldeans. This is the so-called Christian sect of monks in Britain. And let's never forget, when it comes to talking about the Caesars, that these individuals were also, very much like the Egyptians, considered godlike. For instance, Caesar Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar. In fact, most of the key terms used for Jesus were originally attributed to him, to Augustus Caesar, the most important of which was Divi Filius, Son of God. In the picture on the right there, there's Augustus styled, depicted as an Egyptian pharaoh in Nubia. This is very important to bring out. What was the connection between the Roman Caesars and the Egyptians? The book goes into that, looking at the power of the Atnists. And they not only just seated themselves in Britain, but they had large coteries, large followings from Babylon and into Greece. The city of Athens, for instance, which people think is named after the goddess Athena. But could it also be that Athens? Is there a connection there? And what about Rome? What about those great patrician families of Rome who always looked to Egypt as the land of the greatest kings and the greatest pharaohs and the greatest enlighteners? Could the Atnist elite families have taken refuge in Rome? Could they have been working behind some of these elite patrician families of Rome? Could in fact the Romans have come to Britain because they were sent? Instead of thinking that they did it on their own terms, could they have been mercenaries employed by the Atnists in order to continue the suppression of the Druids, which probably wasn't working and taking too long? The Emperor Tiberius Claudius Nero, 42 to 16 BC. He's believed by the author Tony Bushby to be the father, no less, of the biblical Jesus by way of Mary, who lived in Rome. This would make Jesus a member of the powerful Claudian family of Rome. Well, such a man could conceivably commission historians such as Paul to pen whatever he demanded. Abelard Reuchlin, in the true authorship of the New Testament, wrote, "The New Testament, the Church, and Christianity were all creations of the Calpurnius Piso family, who were Roman aristocrats. The New Testament and all the characters in it Jesus, all the Josephs and the Marys, all the disciples, apostles, even Paul and John the Baptist, are all fictional. The head of Scottish Rite Freemasonry in America, a senior member of the Masonic Lodge, Albert Pike, in his Morals and Dogmas, wrote something on this subject. He said the teachers, even of Christianity, are in general the most ignorant of the true meaning of that which they teach. There is no book which is so little known as the Bible. So the characters in the Bible are mythographs. They're based on other characters. The individuals who compiled and wrote the Bible were elites. Elites from Judea, elites from Rome, possibly elites from Britain. The story of the Bible, we go into it in the volumes. It's a fascinating alternative story of who conceived Christianity. Was it really conceived in the East like we're told? Who was Paul? Who were his patrons? Where did this modern form of Atonism, and even one could say modern form of Ammonism in many respects, after all of these different groups appropriated the mythical tropes, the traditions of those that they supplanted. It's all a form of cannibalism. And when we're talking about Christianity, the same thing applies. They say Christianity is based on Judaism. As we saw earlier, what was Judaism based on? Was it based on the Atonism of Egypt?